So, good morning, everybody. Um, you're welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy webinar. This week, we're joined, as always, by a Grass 10 team member, but we've Joseph Dunphy on with us. Joe, we're going to keep you a little bit longer today, I think, just given the current situation on farms. So, rather than having a second speaker on, we'll interrogate Joe for a little bit longer and see if he has any golden nuggets of information as such in terms of, and really the title, Joe, is dealing with the current situation, which is challenging and has been now for a number of weeks. But then I suppose, is there other things that we need to be thinking of from a grassland perspective as well, over the coming weeks and heading into the autumn period. So as always, folks, post your questions. As we know, it is challenging out there on farms. Post your questions and we'll endeavour to ask them as we go. So I suppose, look, thanks, Joe. Joe, you always seem to kind of get the short straw as such. But we're glad to have you on. I'll start, I suppose, normally where we would, what's the current situation out there on farms in terms of grass supply? How is it looking from that perspective?
Yeah, so look, good morning, James, and morning to all your viewers this morning. Yeah, so again, look, we're coming off the back of a couple of what is a very difficult month of July. I was just looking up some information there for the newsletter the other day, James, and when we look at some of the weather information for July, of the long-term average rainfall, we've had 4 times the rain we did in July this year than in 2022, and twice the rainfall in of 2021. If we take a look at the average of some locations around the country, there the long-term average is Athenry during July 259%, Moore Park 242%, Ballyhaise 210, Dunsany and Meath 300%, 3 times the average rainfall. So I know we were coming off the back of a dry June, but even looking at some of the stuff there from Met Éireann as well, there was so many consecutive days of rain in July. There was nearly 15, 16, 17 in spots, so it was just every day there seemed to be a couple of mil, or just topping farms up. So as you said yourself, James, it's difficult, and again, there's different farms that are suffering. There's some farms that are that are wet, but that they're managing by maybe some of the techniques we'll talk about in a few minutes, the on-off graze and the back fence and stuff like that. But then there's other people in different scenarios that they just had too much rain, and there's housing of animals going on. But just on the pasture-based figures for the week, James, we're probably looking at, even though it has been wet, growth are kind of sticking around 60 for the last week. The average farm cover has bumped up a bit again to 752, cover per livestock unit at 223, and probably on average of about, say, a diet of around about 19 kilos, 19 kilos going in there at the minute, and around 3 kilos a meal on average going in the diet. Pre-grazing yields of around 1580.
Okay. So I suppose there's plenty of grass on farm, which seems to be the consensus out there. I suppose it nearly comes on to the point of dealing with it, and how do we get it into them? Do you know what I mean? So yeah. I suppose for those farms, and as I said, look, at grazing conditions are difficult, but they're different from farm to farm as such. Some people are managing not too bad, whereas others are really struggling, Joe. I suppose for the ones that are struggling, I suppose you mentioned some of them there. What's the messaging, or what's the advice, I suppose, to try and keep grass in the diet and continue to work away through the rotation?
Yeah, well, it comes back to we probably mentioned it back in at the end of April there, when things were wet. But it's number one, it's always feed the cow. 2, avoid damage, and 3, hit residual. So I suppose on those particularly dry farm, or particularly heavy farms at the minute that are struggling, the most important thing is to feed the cow at the minute, and try and keep as much grass in the diet as we can, but and protecting the paddock still at the same time. So probably in that scenario, it's still trying to get the 2 bouts of grazing in per day, James, and maybe it is pulling them off at an earlier time in the day and bring them in, and maybe it is bringing them in at night time too, for with a small allocation of silage for the night time, in those particularly wet farms at the minute. Another option too, I think to consider is, and I have heard of one or two people are just housing young stock, just might be for maybe only for a week or something like that, because as you know, James, young stock heifers, in-calf heifers, the walking they do is absolutely phenomenal, and and particularly on heavy parts of farms, they just will create absolute muck. So
they nearly often do more harm than maybe the cows as such.
Yeah.
You mentioned there feeding the cow allocations. Something when you look at group reports of PBA, some people are allocating 19, 20 kilos. Some people are allocating 17 kilos. Where does it need to be at, Joe, to make sure cows are fed properly, I suppose?
We'd need to be talking about 19 kilos these days, James. Probably in those probably 2 to 3 kilos of a good quality nut at the minute, just with the way weather is when dry matters are low. And I suppose the good quality silage going in too, if people are on off, or in that scenario. There is plenty. If we'll talk about maybe the drier farms there in a second, but there is plenty of grass there. If you can get away without the silage, keep going. But again, it's the allocations. Try and get the allocations right. And when they are, if we just look at, I'll just have there some of the dry matters from the last week. Moore Park just in around 13, Ballyhaise 13, Athenry 14. Give the cows that extra little bit of the break. And let them fill themselves, especially just to keep them full.
Yeah, when you're on that, and you're kind of talking there really that probably the vast majority of people at this stage, unless you're on an extremely dry farm, Joe, need to be on 12-hour allocations, bag fencing, just to limit damage. We want to do as little damage, I suppose, going into. We're not near autumn grazing as such. In terms of that last round yet, and we don't want to be doing a lot of damage. But I suppose it's just making sure that cows aren't pinched in that period, is it?
Yeah, it'd be very easy maybe if you've moved to slightly lighter covers and you're trying to get cows to do a good job. But I think as we go back to our 3 priorities, it's feed the cow first and avoid damage. It's cows, if the grass is anyway clean, as if it maybe two rotations ago it got baled or got maybe topped or something there with the Thronians we were talking about coming out of June. The grass should be okay. They should do a decent job without having to be pushed too hard on it.
Yeah, okay. Another one that's coming up, and you mentioned it there in terms of low dry matters and very low for this period in the year, and it's maybe often a conversation we'll be having a little bit later, is for the people that have good quality grass, clover swards, just managing them, Joe, and I suppose that's important with dry matters being low, lots of wet weather. What should farmers be doing to make sure that they don't have issues in terms of bloat?
Yeah, so look, said low dry matters and the amount of rainfall we had is, it is, and very lush, very, very lush. We're back in the vegetative stage of grass at this stage. So we're, the Sharney farms you go to now, the quality is very, very good in general. Very, very good, very, very lush swards at the minute. So there is risks of bloat at the minute. Have heard of 1 or 2 cases that are out there on the ground, so that that we want to avoid it if possible. So I suppose look at the couple of key points are the bloat oil. Okay, and we'll come back to just it in a second, but I suppose it's vital that the bloat oil is in there. We know that the cows are probably going to be drinking a considerable lot less than they were earlier in the year. Say, they might be only back to maybe drinking 20 or 30, 40 kilos of litres of water, whereas maybe that might have been double a couple of weeks ago. So, but still have it in if you are on a high percentage of your farm that's that's in that they're grazing grass clover swards. I suppose a small allocation of fiber as well is absolutely no harm. There's people who have good farms of clover that are maybe throwing a bit of straw at the barrier, maybe a little bit of hay, or just dry enough silage that maybe they're picking at a bit of it when they're coming in for milking. That's no harm either. And I suppose 12-hour wires again, and what some individuals are at is we call it a breakfast break. So they're putting out a break in the paddock, particularly on these damp mornings. Now we'll call it these risky mornings, and maybe cows finishing out a paddock the night before. They're coming into the parlour. They're going out hungry, not awful hungry, but there's a bit of an edge on them after cleaning out a paddock. A breakfast break is a break that, say, from they're going out at, we call it, they're going out between 7 and half 7 in the morning. It's a 2 or 3 hour break that when you go out to lock them in, you will then lift that wire and let them out into the remainder of the paddock. And what that means is it forces them to eat that grass and clover. So they're getting enough. They're getting plenty of grass into them, and along with the clover, they're not going round essentially selecting out all the clover in we'll call it a 2 grazing paddock or something like that. Immediately they're having to do. And I suppose the other thing is, James, just one other thing on that is that, say for instance you have 100 cows and you're milking in a 14 unit parlour, just hold on to maybe 5 or 6 rows, 6 or 7 rows in the morning, and let off, we'll call it 60 or 70 of them together to the field, rather than letting the first 14 out early in the morning at 6:30 and having a complete, free for all on clover there. So just try and hold at least 50%, if not a little bit more, of the herd.
So really, it's, as you say, and you don't want cows going in hungry, I suppose, is into grass clover paddocks either, that they're not. If you feel cows were a little bit underdone in the previous allocation, I suppose you nearly should be trying to stay away from that paddock, and just making sure that they're going in as full as possible. And coming back to the bloat aisle, a lot of farms, some farms have a high percentage of clover on, but a lot of farms, it's a few paddocks here and there that have been put in over the last few years. Joe, these dispensers that we drop in the drinker, I suppose. I'm going to a clover paddock this morning. I'm dropping my dispenser in the drinker. Is that okay?
No, it's pretty much a waste of time, James, because she's going to have her a couple of hours. She'll have an hour of grazing done before she even goes to the drinker. So the bloat oil needs to go in the day before.
And come here, then I suppose the other thing is, in terms of current recommendations, re-fertilizer. Where is that at, I suppose, given there's such a variation in terms of ground conditions? What's the advice regarding fertilizer?
Yeah, so again, look, at the minute it depends. It largely depends, James, on the farm, the farm type. At the minute, again, there's probably people now we're Thursday today. I know there's a bit of there's rain again. There's nearly rain every day, but probably the amount as we get towards the week, I think there might be rain on Saturday night or something like that, fairly heavy rain. But we want to avoid deluges of rain anyway. So keep an eye on the forecast. We want to avoid any heavy downpours when it comes to spreading fertilizer. If you have dry fields on the farm, continue that are grazed recently, it's okay if you're going ahead with them, but just keep an eye on the ground conditions. Probably on grazing field, probably upping it slightly for the early August shake a little bit. We're going to be extending the rotation length now, so probably somewhere between 20 and 25 units, again depending on your allowances on farm.
Okay. Yep. For paddocks, then maybe when it does, and it has to at some stage in terms of the weather conditions turn, paddocks that have got a little bit of damage, any benefit to a bit of P&K in there? What's the thoughts there?
Yeah, a bit of P&K might be no harm, James. Maybe like phosphorus always helps to knit a bit of ground after a bit of damage. Something like a bit of 18-6-12 or something like that will help that paddock.
Okay, very good. The other thing is, and something that's, I suppose, cropping up and is frustrating farmers at the moment is, look, at some people have second cuts done, but there's still a fair share of them. Still a fair share of them to be done, but this whole area in terms of around fodder, I seen the National Fodder Committee, the surveys completed for that. There's about 15% of farms, I think, if I'm right in saying, showing a deficit, Joe. But nobody envisaged as such maybe having to feed silage on some farms at this stage. So what's the advice around the whole area of fodder and the fodder situation at the moment?
Well, yeah, James, I suppose look at the key thing to everything in terms of when it comes to fodder is to act early or as early as possible when you realise that there is an issue on farm or there is a slight deficit. I suppose probably since the last time we talked about fodder, you know, some people will call it, during it's July has been a smash and grab for second cut silage. As I said, some people have got caught out and haven't got it yet, and now we'll probably just have to wait until ground conditions allow. But probably the best thing to do, we'll call it people who have got their second cut in, review, or update your fodder budget from earlier. If you were short last year, you did a fodder budget there, say after first cut or something, update that fodder budget now. Have a look at the settle height of your second cut pit, review where you are, and make a plan then that if you still are short. And I suppose the key thing is we don't want people that they need 1,000 ton and they end up with 1,000 ton. We want somewhere between the 10 and 20% surplus to allow for a time like now, or a wet October, or a wet February next year, so to have that surplus available on farm. So the key thing is to update your budgets and react quickly now if needs be.
For those farms that do find themselves in deficit, really, what are we talking about there? Looking at maybe, is there surplus stock on farm that don't need to be carried next winter? And I suppose, as you say, it's about trying to get feed in the yard early and get feed sourced.
Yeah, 100%. So like on the it's probably, I suppose, last year with the high milk price, people were reluctant maybe to sell off those maybe a few culls or something like that, and maybe they were kept over, or maybe the empties were milked on later. But milk prices dropped this year. Maybe fertilizer price probably on the way back up a little bit. Meal price probably on the way back up a little bit with maybe what's going on as well. So it may be a better, maybe a year that to consider those, we'll call them late calvers, maybe maybe empty cows, something like that. Especially if you are short in winter feed. And I suppose then it's to do I need 40 bales, 50 bales, whatever many bales I need, and maybe go early to the market for them if needs be.
Yep, very good. The last point I suppose I wanted to ask you about, and it's we have to talk about it as such, but it's strange to be talking about it in such conditions, is this whole area of autumn grass and building cover and extending the period. And I suppose for a lot of farms, the most important part of that last round is, yes, we want to extend the rotation, but it's about setting the farm up for spring as well, Joe. So
yeah,
I seen there recently in terms of with a chat with advisors, you had some good advice about that. Can you maybe run through that? I suppose the first question is every farm the same? Often there was the one blueprint as such previously. I suppose that has been tweaked, and we've realised that's not the case over the years. So maybe just a few key points around autumn grass.
Yeah, well, I suppose bringing it back very, very simply, James, is I suppose, why are we doing it? And the big point is, especially with some of the costs of the alternatives where they are now, if we take the old money, James, we'll call it summer grass worth 4 cents a kilo and autumn worth 11. Now this is before any increases came, so we could call that 30 or 40% higher now in terms of those values. But essentially what we're trying to do is we want to essentially buy grass at 4 cents a kilo or €40 a ton, and sell it back to the cow later on in the year at €110 a ton. And that's it. If someone said to you, would you invest in something at €40 a ton to get 110 of a return? The reality is you will probably say yes. So essentially that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a bit of grass on the farm now during August cheaply, and sell it back to the cow later on in the year when the costs of the feed alternatives are much higher. So if we said it was 4 and 11, like, you can pretty much put 30 or 40% on that with where the costs of the alternatives are now on farm. So that's what we're trying to do. That's it's essentially, we'll go through some of the targets there in a second, but we're just trying to build that little bit of rotation length on farms. And I suppose, as I said, James, no two farms are the same. The two things are, two key considerations are land type is going to have a huge impact on it, and also grazing infrastructure is going to have a huge impact on it, because you may have a farm that we would call reasonably dry, but if the grazing infrastructure is poor, if there's large paddocks, if the access is poor into them, sometimes nearly a heavier soil might might do a better job in the autumn because there'll be less damage done because they're able to get cows in and out of paddocks and a bit quicker and or with less damage. And I suppose from that outset, it's important to think of there's be paddocks on your farm where there were 3 grazing paddocks all year. They're going to be 5 grazing paddocks or 6 grazing paddocks later on in the year. We'll call them 5, like with some of the heavier covers on them. So you have to think of that. Okay, is that field conducive to having 2 more grazings in dodgier weather later on in the year? And if it's not, you just don't build a cover there, So, yeah. I suppose the two differences, James, we start with the heavy soils farmers, maybe, or farmers that way. Like with the average, we don't build past 900 really, and like that's kind of where we want to get. And what we don't want there is we don't want any covers maybe over 1800. The only caveat to that is maybe there's a field that's quite dry and has very good access on it. You may decide on that field to maybe build a 20, up to 2 ton or a little bit over. But the reality is that we want to keep the pre-grazing yields to 1800. And the average farm cover in around 900. Okay, on the drier soils, we can probably build to 1050, 1100, no problem on that, allowing the pre-grazing yield to probably get up to 2200. But then again, it comes back to it again, James, the grazing infrastructure has to be good. Like if we're not going at it, and it's probably something that's been leveled at us in the past, James, is I can't build 1100 on my farm of an average farm cover. Well, if the grazing infrastructure isn't there, don't even dream about it. It's as simple as that. If you've multiple access points, you've roads on 2 sides, so stuff like that, you can do a hell of a lot in the back end with a 1050 or 1100 of a peak cover.
Yeah. So that's really it's really 950 for the heavier farms. The big thing there is, okay, you're going to be in 10 days earlier probably, but the reality is if you can set the farm up right and you're not carrying unwanted grass as such across and into next spring is what we don't want. Whereas for the drier farms, you're looking at that 1100, 1150 is probably where it's at. When are we starting this building grass discussion, or when does it start on farms?
So again, James, that's largely based on your stocking rate. So I suppose we'll come at it from someone that's maybe stocked at 2.5, 2.6 now at the minute, James. Maybe with all the silage ground back in, they probably don't even need to think. They're actually probably thinking about taking out grass if the weather conditions allow. In a normal end of July, early August, they'd be taking out bales until nearly the middle of the month. Yes. Because they're going to build so organically on the farm. It's more of we'll call it the people who are stocked at maybe 3 on the milking platform or 3.5. So if someone's at 3.5, the reality is we're there now, James. We need to start keeping an eye on it. We kind of said, someone at 3.5, 1st of August, or first week of August, someone at 3 of a livestock unit, probably the 2nd week of August. So that's where we need to be.
Very good. Another question in there, and it's around milk ureas and just a comment that they've risen in recent weather. What's the best way to counteract that excess N to grass? And it's really around protecting, I suppose, both fertility performance and solids. It's probably that's coming a bit, I'd say, from background N in that dry period, and maybe look at fertilizer applications. Joe probably is one, and look at in terms of the protein in your ration is another. But I wouldn't get too concerned if it's only elevated for a short period in terms of for that kind of maybe 5 to 7 days or whatever it is. It normally settles back down. Or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you. Actually, funny, I was talking with a group the other day and they were saying that they thought they actually only rose a bit when the rain came there in July, and they've actually stayed fairly steady. Probably this year, there's probably not the huge amounts. I'd say people are still kind of watching themselves on the nitrogen. People are being a little bit more sticking to, we'll call it the 18, 19 units on grass onlys, whereas maybe other years there was more fertilizer going out, call it 3 or 4 years ago, maybe there after droughts and stuff like that. So I'd say there's probably not the background in other years that or this year than there was in other years, just from what I've seen anyway so far.
Yeah, very good. I suppose then, if there's no more questions, folks, think I'm happy enough. We've covered a lot of stuff. Joe, I suppose if you were to wrap it up now for the next week, 10 days, I suppose, just to summarize there what we've spoken about, what's the key things? What's the key things our listeners need to maybe focus on and think about?
Yeah. So again, as we said from this, from the start, James, just on the current management, you know, it's 12-hour wires on we call it dry farms. It's 12-hour wires. Watch yourself that you don't pinch the cows. Give them the good full allocations, probably 2 to 3 kilos a meal in that scenario, especially when dry matters are so low. Heavy soils, it's trying to protect, it's trying to feed the cow and avoid avoid damage. You know, if it means that cows maybe have to go on off grazing, brought in at night with a small allocation of silage, you know, that be it. But you know, we want to avoid huge amounts of damage being done. You know, the fertilizer where it's okay, probably up in it slightly now, maybe 20 to 25 units, just when we're extending that rotation length now into August. Keeping an eye on the bloat oil, and also the other techniques on the bloat. It's not a one thing is going to solve everything. It's the breakfast break, you know, it's the bit of fiber, you know, and it's bloat oil and all in, and not letting cows into paddocks hungry. And I suppose then the last, or the two last points on the fodder budgeting, updated if the second cut that's after being harvested in, you know, in the last couple of weeks, and reassess, think of the culls, you know, for moving off maybe a little bit earlier, or going to the market for some bale silage. And lastly, on the autumn targets, look, it's in this week's newsletter. You know, lower stock, maybe 2.5, 2.6 are okay for another number of weeks, but the higher stock people, maybe on 3.5 on milking platforms, really need to start looking at the targets from now on and assessing where they are in relation to, and start extending that rotation length out, you know, during August. So if we take an example, maybe someone at 3, you know, we want them to be at, say, between 25 and 30 days by the end of the month. So just have a look at the targets and go from there.
Lovely, appreciate that. As always, hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel in terms of improvement in weather next week. And as always, folks, thanks to Joe Dunphy, and farm safely.